Hey, you made it. Tonight we're going to talk about a job so miserable, so isolating, that even the village rat catcher probably looked down on it. And that's saying something. Because in medieval Europe, where your neighbor might casually die of a toothache or get accused of witchcraft for sneezing during church, there was still one role people feared more than death itself: being the executioner. Now I know. It sounds intense. Probably even a little bit edgy. But hang on, because the truth is a lot less thrilling and way more pitiful. You didn't become an executioner because you wanted to serve justice. You became one because your dad did, and his dad before that. No glory, no career. Choice? Just a family trade soaked in blood and social exile. You were born into a life where your last name was basically a public health warning. While other kids played with wooden swords or chased chickens, you learned how to sever heads without making a mess. Not because it was cool, but because if you messed up, the same crowd that cheered you would turn on you faster than a spoiled jug of ale. Imagine learning how to kill before you learn how to spell, and still getting kicked out of church. You were the most feared man in town, but never invited to dinner. You upheld the law but weren't allowed in the market. People crossed the street when you walked by, and not out of respect. Out of disgust. You were society's most useful tool, and its most discarded one. Not a villain, not a hero, just a shadow that everyone agreed not to look at for too long. So tonight, as you get cozy and let the world slow down, let's step into that life, the one behind the hood, behind the axe, behind the silence. A world where justice has a cost, and it's almost always paid in loneliness. Go ahead and dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and let your mind settle. This isn't a horror story, it's just history, the kind people preferred to forget, but don't worry, and I haven't forgotten. And neither has the axe. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of calm, curious descent into the corners of history no one talks about, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening while winding down for the night, just breathe, relax, and let the past carry you gently towards sleep. You ready? Good. Let's begin. You didn't choose the axe life. The axe life chose you. You weren't even old enough to walk when it began. Swaddled in wool, baptized in holy water and branded, socially, spiritually, generationally, by the weight of a title no one spoke out loud. Other children were born to farm, to sow, to pray. You were born to swing. Your father was the executioner. That made you the executioner's son, which in medieval Europe wasn't just an observation, it was a life sentence. You didn't need to be trained to kill yet. You didn't even need to know how to hold a blade. All you had to do was exist, and already the world turned away from you. Mothers clutched their children when you passed. Priests hesitated before offering blessings. One time a woman tossed salt over her shoulder just because you looked in her direction. You were 5. It was never spoken outright, but the message was clear. You were not normal, you were not welcome. Not really. You might live in the village, but not in its heart. You were raised on the outskirts, literally and figuratively. Your home stood beyond the last row of cottages, past the well-worn paths, closer to the gallows than to the market. They called it tradition, but it felt like isolation in disguise. From the moment you could toddle, you knew you were different. Your toys weren't carved knights or painted dolls. You had wooden blocks shaped like stocks, a miniature scaffold, a dull practice blade. While other kids played tag, you were learning how to set up a hanging without it turning into a spectacle. It was all play, of course, until it wasn't. Your father taught you early, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. The role passed from father to son, as predictably as the seasons. You didn't apply for it. You inherited it, like a cursed heirloom wrapped in dried blood and forced smiles. He showed you how to oil the axe, how to tie the knots, how to measure. The drop so the spine broke quick. You didn't understand at first, but you obeyed, you always obeyed. At supper, the talk wasn't of crop yields or marriage prospects. It was about tendons, muscle resistance, crowd control. One night you asked your father how many swings it should take. He said 1, always 1, or they scream. Then he passed the bread like he'd just commented on the weather. You were young, but not innocent. That was stripped from you faster than the condemned were stripped of their last rites. You grew up knowing that no matter how well you behaved, how kind you were, how smart or sweet or funny you tried to be, none of it mattered. You were still the son of the executioner, and that made you different, dangerous, untouchable. Children laughed behind your back. Some ran when you approached. One brave soul threw a stone once. It didn't hit, but the message did. We know what you are. Not who, what. It got to you. Of course it did. But you didn't cry. You just stood still, the way your father did, and you practiced the stare. That quiet, unreadable, hollow look that made people back off. The look that said, you could be next. It worked. Eventually they stopped throwing things, stopped teasing, stopped speaking altogether. You were feared, not respected, not loved, just feared. But fear was safer than pity, and miles better than contempt. The church was no refuge either. Some Sundays you were turned away outright. Other times the priest would cast nervous glances your way, as if waiting for your shadow to start bleeding. And the townsfolk, they kept their distance. Even in the house of God, you were a reminder of something no one wanted to look at too closely. When you asked your father about it, he shrugged. It's the cost of the job, he said. They want justice, but they don't want to see how it's done. So you learned, slowly, quietly. You learned how to exist in spaces that didn't want you, how to move without being noticed, how to sharpen a blade until it gleamed in the dark, how to carry shame without letting it show, and through it all you waited, because one day the job would be yours, whether you wanted it or not, because you didn't choose this life, you were born to it, and the axe doesn't care what you want. By now the village doesn't flinch when they see you coming. They simply look away. You're older. Your hands are calloused. Your eyes don't blink at the sight of blood. You've stopped trying to make friends, not because you don't want them, but because you've learned the truth. No one wants to bond with the blade that might one day end their father's life. You begin your apprenticeship the way all executioners do, with silence, steel, and practice. Pigs. You learn how to grip the axe, not too tight or your muscles cramp, not too loose or it slips. You learn the weight of it, its balance, the way it sings when it slices through air just right. You start with carcasses, then small game, then eventually criminals no one will miss. You don't ask questions, you just swing. There's no ceremony for your first execution, no blessings, no trumpets, just a man in shackles, a platform, and the quiet murmurs of a crowd pretending they don't know you. You remember the first time. The condemned was young, maybe too young. His hands trembled as he knelt. His eyes never left yours. You wished he'd spit or curse or beg. But he didn't. He just looked at you, like he wanted to ask why. You gave him mercy. At least you tried. One clean swing, that's the goal, that's the mantra. Always one or they scream. You'd rehearsed it for years. You thought you were ready. You weren't. Your hands shook. Your breath hitched. And when you swung, the blade hit just a little too high, not fatal, not clean. The body convulsed. The crowd gasped. And you had to do it again. The second swing landed true. But it didn't matter. You'd already failed. Later you vomited behind the scaffold. Your father didn't speak, just handed you a cloth and turned away. That night you didn't sleep. You don't get used to it, not really. You just learn how to wear the weight better. Like a heavy cloak you can't take off. The work becomes routine. But the faces, they linger. In dreams, in the quiet moments, in the reflections you no longer dare to meet. You study anatomy, not for science but for precision, where the spine curves, how the ligaments stretch. You learn how far to drop the body in a hanging, so it breaks clean but doesn't rip. Too short they strangle, too long they tear. Either way the crowd notices, and the crowd remembers. That's the thing. They watch every move you make. They pretend to hate what you do, but they lean in. They judge, they whisper. One botched execution and you're the subject of gossip for weeks. He missed. He trembled. He cried. You didn't. But rumors don't care about the truth. They only care about the show. You learn crowd control. Where to stand, so the blood splatter doesn't hit the baker's wife. How to read the tension, when to pause, when to swing, when to say something to calm the murmurs. You are part executioner, part actor, part ritual priest. Sometimes the sheriff tells you to draw it out. Make it last, he says. This one's a lesson. Other times you're told to keep it quiet. No spectacle today. You comply. You always comply. You are not a person to them. You're a function, an endpoint, a final period at the end of their problems. And the worst part? You're getting good at it. You start sleeping less, eating less. You develop a stare that unnerves. For even the magistrate, no one asks how you're doing. They assume you're fine because you have to be. They need you to be. The machine doesn't run if the blade cracks. But you're not fine. You hear the thump of heads in your dreams. You wake with phantom blood on your hands. You see the twitch of nerves, the slack of limbs, the brief moment between life and death, where time feels like it's holding its breath. You carry it all still. You sharpen your blade. You show up. You bow your head when the priest refuses you confession. You stand straight when children hide behind their mothers. And you do the job, because it is a job. Not a calling, not a destiny. A grim inheritance you carry like a coffin on your back. You become what they need, silent, efficient, invisible until summoned, because in this world, justice must be served. And someone has to serve it, even if that someone stops feeling like a person at all. No one tells you what to do after the crowd leaves. They don't see the part where you clean the axe, or the blood, or the platform. They don't see the rags soaked in someone's last moment. They don't hear the bones crack or the wet thud of a body dropped just a little too hard. They don't feel what sticks to your boots. But you do. They call it justice. You call it Thursday and then they walk away. That's the part that stays with you, not the execution, the after, the silence, the emptiness. You return to your home, which isn't really a home. It's a hut, a shack, a place just beyond the city walls, far enough away that the town can pretend you're not real. You hear the bells of the church from your window, but they do not toll for you. They toll for the ones who belong. You never belonged. You eat alone. You sleep alone. You shop after dark, if you're allowed in the market at all. Some vendors leave goods out, like offerings, too afraid to take your coin directly. Others refuse entirely, crossing themselves or muttering prayers under their breath. Unclean, they whisper. Cursed. You've tried to wash the smell off your skin. You can't. Even your house knows who you are. It groans when you return. It creaks like it's warning the air itself. The wind doesn't howl, it holds its breath. You were a boy once, a child who thought maybe, just maybe, this job wouldn't steal everything. That you could swing the axe and still laugh at jokes. That you could do the job and still be seen as human. You were wrong. There is no version of this where you get to keep yourself romance. Forget it. No one marries the hangman's son. Even the town drunk won't sit next to you, and he once tried to marry a pig. If you do manage to find someone, another outcast, a gravedigger's widow, a leper's niece, it's not love. It's logistics, it's survival. It's silence next to silence. If you have children, they're born already marked. Same name, same job, same sideways glances in the street. You don't raise them, you train them. They swing wood axes at practice. Dummies while you watch, praying that they miss. But they rarely do. The cycle continues. You stop attending town gatherings, then church, then the market. Eventually, the only place you go is the scaffold. And even that feels like too much. You think maybe if you perform well enough, they'll remember that you're trying, that you're carrying something no one else wants to carry, that you didn't ask for this, but they don't. You could save a drowning child, and the baker would still whisper, "He's the one who needed 2 swings last spring." You could donate your earnings to the church, and the priest would still refuse you communion. You serve the law, but the law does not serve you. You are its hands, not its heart. And one day your hands begin to shake, not much at first. Just a little tremble when you pour water or tie a rope. You hide it, you pretend it's nothing, but it grows and people notice. The sheriff says nothing, but he starts calling your apprentice more often. Your son, your cousin, whoever's next, in the line. He does the floggings now, the brandings, the easy stuff. You are quietly being replaced. There's no ceremony, no thank you for your service. Just fewer knocks at the door, fewer coins on the windowsill. Your tools begin to rust. The blade dulls. Your back aches when you rise, and then one day it's over. No one says it out loud, but the silence is enough. You don't swing the axe anymore. You sit by the fire, you stare at the floor. You remember the names of people no one else remembers. And when you die, it's not dramatic. No epic final words, no crowd, no priest. You're buried outside the cemetery walls near the gallows. The same gallows you stood beside for decades, the same platform where justice was served and forgiveness never arrived, no headstone. Just dirt. And within days the town forgets you. They need a new executioner, someone younger, someone quieter, someone who won't tremble when the blade drops. The cycle begins again. A son, a nephew, a name passed like a curse, because justice doesn't remember, it only requires. Let's start with something simple. Not everyone in medieval Europe was born to be a knight, a noble, or a monk. Most people didn't grow up with dreams of glory or parchment-thin sainthood. They were born into roles, stable hands, weavers, bakers, jobs that weren't glamorous but made the world turn. And for a few unfortunate souls, that role came with an axe. Now, when you picture the medieval executioner, you probably imagine someone grizzled, cloaked in black, maybe even hiding behind a hood. But that image skips over the more disturbing truth. Many executioners didn't choose their work. They inherited it, passed down like a family curse. You see, in many parts of medieval Europe, execution wasn't a profession you applied for. There were no job boards advertising open scaffold positions. No enthusiastic lines of candidates eager to manage public hangings. Towns had executioners because they had to, and once someone agreed, Haynor was forced to take the role, it tended to stay in the family, permanently. So if your father was the one holding the blade, then congratulations, you were born with a job. From your very first breath, you belonged to a class of people needed by society, but never welcomed by it. That might sound dramatic, but for executioners, this was the ordinary rhythm of life. You might have lived in a modest cottage near the town's edge, not because you were poor, but because no one wanted to live beside you. Your family couldn't own property inside the city walls in many places. That was for respectable folk. You were close enough to be summoned, but far enough to be forgotten. The job followed you like smoke. Even as a child, you felt its presence. Other kids were told not to play with you. Some didn't need to be told. They simply knew. At church, if your family was allowed in at all, it was often to the back pews. In some towns, executioner families weren't welcome in sacred spaces at all. You weren't excommunicated, but you were treated like the dirt between the stones. Not worth noticing, yet always underfoot. Even the marketplace, which brought together peasants, priests, and thieves, had its rules for your kind. Vendors might leave your family's purchases in a separate pile. Coins were taken with hesitation. Some merchants used tongs, others simply turned away. You could hold clean silver in your hand and still be told it was unfit. This wasn't because you were cruel. It wasn't even because you'd done anything yet. Often the social stain came before the first swing. Children of executioners were marked before they lifted a blade, and while the job paid better than most, it had to convince anyone to do it. Money didn't buy back your reputation. It bought silence, space, and maybe a few extra feet at the tavern bench where no one would dare sit too close. As you grew older, the separation only deepened. Your father, perhaps a man with steady hands and a quiet voice, wouldn't have spoken much about his work. Not out of shame, but because there wasn't much to say. The task was clear. Make it quick, make it clean, make it final. There was no glory in it, no ceremony beyond the official sentence. Yet everything in your household prepared you for that moment. You might have learned to sharpen blades before you learned to read. You'd understand the difference between chopping wood and severing vertebrae by the time you were 10. The tools of your trade weren't hidden. They were cared for with precision. The axe, the rope, the cloth for blindfolds. You'd oil them, fold them, stack them in silence. It wasn't about bloodlust, it was about order. There was no practice gallows for children, no training manuals for teenagers. You learned by watching, then helping, then doing. Maybe your first job was branding a thief's skin, or tying a knot on the gallows beam. Maybe you held the bucket, or scrubbed the scaffold after the crowds left. These weren't rites of passage, they were necessities. You did the work because someone had to, and because no one else would. In towns where executions were public, and most were, you didn't just kill. You performed, The townspeople would gather to watch justice done, but afterward they'd avoid eye contact. They'd gasp at the spectacle, cheer at the verdict, and then cross the street to avoid passing the man who made it happen. Or the, "Boy, if you were old enough to swing before your beard grew in," even if you were kind. Even if you helped stray cats and shared your bread, it didn't matter. Your family name might as well have been a warning. In some regions, executioner families were denied the right to marry outside their profession. You were expected to wed the daughter of another executioner, or perhaps a gravedigger, a knacker, someone else society kept at arm's length. It wasn't about compatibility. It was about containment. The shame, of course, was never official. Towns didn't declare it. Priests didn't preach it. But it was everywhere. In the sideways glances, the unspoken rules, the silence that followed when you entered a room. You weren't just part of the town, you were its necessary ghost. And yet, the town needed you, desperately. Without you, justice was incomplete. Punishment was unfulfilled. The law had no teeth. The same people who whispered about you behind their doors were the ones who expected you to show up when the time came, to stand calmly in front of a restless crowd and swing cleanly, quickly, without hesitation. That was your inheritance, not gold, not land, but a heavy axe, a quiet house, and the knowledge that your existence made others comfortable. As long as you stayed invisible, so you carried the burden. You learned the trade. You accepted the space carved out for your family by fear and necessity. But deep down, maybe even as a child, a thought remained, unspoken but persistent. What if you didn't want this life? What if you had a gift for music or healing or carpentry? What if you wanted to walk through the town without the weight of other people's sins hanging on your back? What if you weren't the executioner's child, but simply a child? That thought stayed with you. It would shape your choices, your silences, your sleep. Because once branded by the axe, the world never let you forget it. And eventually the day would come when the axe would pass to you, when your father's hands, once so steady, would tremble with age. And your own would be called to do the town's dirtiest work. The question then wasn't whether you'd do it. The question was how long it would take before the weight became too much to carry. You've stepped onto the scaffold now, not literally, not yet. But this is the part where the shadows start to lengthen, where your childhood of side glances and quiet meals hardens into something sharper, heavier. You've grown tall, strong enough to carry wood, haul rope, and swing steel without shaking. The axe is no longer something you fetch for your father. It's something you hold, and the townspeople know it. They may not say your name aloud, but they know it. You feel it in the market, in the way shopkeepers move your bread to a separate basket, how their smiles flatten when you approach. You notice how strangers are told about you in hushed tones before they even meet you. That's the one, don't stare. You'd think it would hurt less over time, that the cold shoulder becomes comfortable, like a cloak you get used to wearing. But in truth, it never stops stinging. It just dulls, like an old bruise. You learn to expect nothing from others, no kindness, no welcome. Just a quiet need, because that's what you are, a solution, a necessity. The last name called when all other paths fail. You don't get many friends, but you do get structure. And in the world of the executioner, structure is everything. There's a grim rhythm to the work. Not just the executions. Those come irregularly when the sheriff reads out the names and the magistrates hand down a sentence. The rituals extend beyond the moment of death. It begins well before the act. You're often brought in early, told the date and time, given the details, who they are, what they did, what the crowd is expecting. Because yes, that's a factor. If it's a noble, you're told to keep it clean. If it's a thief, no one minds if the blade isn't perfect. A heretic? The townspeople might prefer something slow, dramatic. There's an audience. There's always an audience. You spend the night before preparing. You lay out your tools like a craftsman. The axe is sharpened, not too thin or it'll glance, not too thick or it'll crush. Rope is checked for fraying. Knots are retied, pulled taut, then loosened again. Sometimes you're told to build the gallows yourself or inspect the pyre. Fire needs to be controlled. A slow burn is a mistake. Even death needs efficiency. You might pray. Not for your soul. There's debate over whether you're even allowed. One, but for your hands. You pray they don't slip, that the body falls clean, that the sound the crowd hears is swift and final, not clumsy or hesitant. You don't fear blood. You fear the second swing, because a second swing lingers. You've seen it before. The executioner who took 3 tries, the one whose hands trembled, the one whose axe bounced. The crowd doesn't forget. They remember the screams. They remember the laughter that shouldn't have happened. They remember your mistake long after. They forget the crime. You're allowed no mercy, even if you offer it. So you practice, not on people, of course, on logs, on pigs, on ropes with sacks of grain. You watch your form in the reflection of water. You work on balance, stance, breathing. You do everything possible to make sure that when the moment comes, you don't hesitate. Because hesitation is weakness. And weakness in your world is a death sentence all its own. Then comes the morning. You rise early, wash, dress in clothes that are clean but unremarkable, no flamboyance, no decoration. Your hood, if you wear one, is for the crowd, not for modesty. It's tradition in some towns, a way of separating the man from the act. They like it that way. They prefer not to see your face when the blade drops. It keeps things simpler, less human. You arrive before the crowds gather. The sheriff gives you a nod. No handshake, just the nod. Sometimes a coin pouch follows, heavy with the weight of silver and expectation. Occasionally there's a request, make it quick, or draw it out. You never answer, you just nod. The condemned is brought out, man, woman, child, though the latter is rare. Their crimes vary, theft, heresy, murder, treason. Some scream, some cry, some go silent. You see it in their eyes. Defiance, regret, confusion. You see the ones who know they deserve it. You see the ones who don't understand what's happening at all. You don't speak to them. That's not your role. You're not the judge. You're not the priest. You're not there to offer peace or vengeance. You are a mechanism, a final step in a system too large to question. The crowd watches, some with horror, some with fascination, children lifted on shoulders, vendors selling food near the edge of the square. It's a spectacle, a warning dressed as entertainment. And you are the final act. The words are read. The sentence is announced, the crowd hushes. Then you act. The axe swings, or the trapdoor drops, or the flames catch. Whatever the method, you ensure that it is done properly. Pain, when possible, is kept short. Suffering is not your goal, though some pretend it is. Your skill lies in control, not cruelty. And when it's over, there is no applause, just the rustle of people leaving. Some shake their heads. Others avert their eyes. You step away from the body. You don't stay for the cleanup, unless of course you're the one responsible for that too, which in many towns you are. See, being an executioner isn't just about the execution. It's about the aftermath, burning the remains, burying them, scrubbing the stains. Sometimes it's torture beforehand, or flogging, or public shaming. You become the town's all-purpose horror technician. The blade, the rope, the nail, the fire. The crowd disappears, but you remain. You finish the job. You pack the tools. You carry the body. You clean the block. And when the town sleeps, you walk home. Alone. No one speaks to you. No one thanks you. You eat dinner in silence. Wash your hands until the blood's gone. Then you sit, stare at the wall. Sleep if you can. Sometimes you can't. It's not the blood that lingers. Not always. It's the looks, the trembling, the resigned stillness of a face accepting its end. The ones who went peacefully haunt you more than the ones who fought, because you wonder what they knew, what they understood that you didn't. You keep these thoughts to yourself. There's no priest to confess to, no therapist, no friend to hold your secrets. You bear them as your father did, quietly, with hands that no longer shake, but sometimes clench without meaning to. This is your role, not chosen, not celebrated, but essential. And when on occasion someone new moves to town and asks who you are, they're told the truth in 3 words. That's the executioner, and that's all they'll ever need to know. But in quiet moments, when the square is empty and the tools are clean, you still remember that one question you asked long ago before you ever held the axe. What if you wanted something else? No one tells you how it ends. Not really. There's no retirement for an executioner, no ceremony, no parade. You don't hand over the axe at a banquet while the mayor gives a speech and villagers applaud your years of loyal service. You just stop being summoned. At first it's small things. A younger man is asked to assist you during a flogging. He's stronger, they say, or faster, or maybe just easier to look at. You don't argue, you've learned not to. You train him, of course. Show him how to hold the axe, how to step forward without trembling. You teach him the rules no one speaks aloud. Eventually, your name stops appearing on the notices. The sheriff passes your house without knocking. You don't ask why, you already know there's a younger man now, or maybe your own son if you had one, someone else with steady hands and an unblemished name. Well, not unblemished, but not yet familiar enough to haunt. The town hasn't forgotten you. They still avoid you, still cross themselves when you walk by. But they've moved on, as towns do. Your cottage remains on the edge of the fields, tucked behind overgrowth, a little. Closer to the graveyard than anyone likes to admit. You still sharpen the axe, though now it's more out of habit than necessity. You still walk the perimeter, still check the ropes as if someone might come knocking. But no one does, and so your days slow. You tend the garden, repair your boots, chop wood in long, silent afternoons. You drink more now, not much, just enough to dull the echo of all those moments you can't quite forget. There are nights when you lie awake and remember each swing. Not the motion, your body doesn't need help remembering that, but the faces, the sounds, the looks. You don't remember names, just eyes, some furious, some glassy, some so calm it chilled you worse than any winter. Those are the ones that return most often in your sleep. You've tried to forget. You've tried to pretend the blade was just a tool, that you were just a hand. But that's not how it works. Over time, something creeps in. A quiet question, sharp as steel and just as cold. What if they were innocent? You don't say it aloud. You wouldn't dare. Not to your wife if you had one. Not to the priest, who never quite looked you in the eye. Not even to yourself when the house creaks with wind and memory. Because if even one of them was innocent, what does that make you? You'd like to think it was justice, that the law was clear, the trials fair, that the town made its decision, and you simply carried it out. But you saw the way some verdicts were passed, the way a magistrate's nod could mean life or death, the way power protected itself while the poor were left to dangle. You saw who ended up on the block, and who never did. Over the years you began to wonder if the executioner didn't enforce justice at all, but simply erased its absence. That thought sticks. You try to ignore it, focus on your hands, your tools, your garden. But it's there like a splinter beneath the skin of your soul, and as you age, the splinters multiply. Some days, your hands shake, not from fear, from time. From where? You drop things more often now, your knees creak when you bend, your eyesight dims. You feel the hours in your spine, the years in your joints. The axe rests against the wall untouched. Its edge still gleams, because you keep it that way, not for use, for memory. You think about what your life could have been, not out of bitterness but curiosity. Maybe you could have made shoes or taught letters. Maybe you could have sung hymns or carved wood into saints. Maybe if you had been born to any other family, the townspeople would have waved at you, instead of away, from you. But you weren't. You were born with a job and now no longer needed. You fade, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, like mist on the fields at sunrise. And when the end comes, it doesn't arrive with ceremony or noise. It comes in the form of a cough, a fall, a winter that lingers too long in your chest. Maybe someone notices the smoke, hasn't risen from your chimney in a few days. Maybe they send a servant to check, or maybe they don't. Either way, you die the same way you lived, useful, distant, forgotten. They might find your body slumped in the chair near the fire, or curled in bed, one hand still curled as if grasping an invisible handle. The axe might be nearby, or maybe buried behind the shed, placed there long ago when you realized you wouldn't be called again. There's no funeral, no tolling bell. The priest says a few words maybe, but not in church. You're buried outside the gate, the same gate you weren't allowed to live inside, just beyond the cemetery wall, near the ditch where they bury exiles and strangers. There's a marker, perhaps, a bit of wood, a stone, no name carved in it, just a patch of earth quickly forgotten. The grave of a man who buried hundreds, yet was never quite allowed to be part of the town that asked him to do it. You leave behind no sons, or perhaps just one, and he knows what's coming. The same job, the same house, the same whispers, the cycle will begin again, because every town needs an executioner, but they never want to see his face. And so you vanish. A necessary man, now unnecessary. A shadow, given shape only when blood needed spilling. Your name, if remembered, will be followed by a shrug, a mutter, maybe just a word, executioner. That's all you were in the eyes of the world, but maybe, just maybe, you were something else. Maybe you carried the weight so others didn't have to. Maybe that matters, even if no one ever says so. It began the way many myths do, quietly and completely by accident. The year was 1848. The place, a small mill construction site on the edge of the American River in Northern California. And the man was James W. Marshall, a carpenter by trade. Nobody famous, nobody particularly important, just a man working on a sawmill in a shallow valley filled with dry wind and pine needles. He wasn't looking for wealth. Not really. He was trying to build something for another man, John Sutter, an ambitious Swiss settler with dreams of carving out an agricultural empire. But on that particular January day, Marshall noticed something glinting in the ditch. At first, he didn't. Believe it, who would? It was small. Shiny, maybe brass, maybe just a trick of the light. But when he rubbed it between his fingers and saw it keep its luster, when it passed the old scratch test, he knew. Gold. Real gold. Marshall told Sutter, of course, and Sutter, rather than cheering, cursed his luck. He wasn't stupid. He knew what gold would bring. Not comfort, not progress, but chaos, people, noise, strangers trampling over his dreams with shovels and pickaxes. So they tried to keep it quiet. They failed. And for that, they were met with suspicion, violence, and eventually, taxes meant to drive them out. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 was targeted directly at them. It didn't stop them from digging, just made them dig harder for less. Others were pushed out too. Mexicans, Chileans, free black men. Even white miners from the East who arrived too late were sometimes bullied out of claims by those who'd gotten there a month earlier. The gold didn't discriminate, but the men certainly did. Justice in the camps wasn't a courtroom, it was a rope or a bullet or a shove into the river late at night. So where does that leave you? Let's say you've lasted a year, maybe two. Your shoulders ache, your skin's cracked. Your clothes are patched with canvas and caked in mud. You still carry your pan, but it's more out of habit than hope. And maybe, just maybe, you've finally found something. One glint, then another. A pocket of dust in a bend of the river that others missed. You cash it in, you get coin, real coin. You head to the nearest town, buy a warm meal, maybe a better pair of boots. You sleep in a real bed for the first time in months. Then, you wake up and it's all gone. Robbed, swindled, cheated, or maybe just lost in a haze of cards and whiskey and too much noise. You walk back to your hole with nothing but a hangover and a story, and still you stay. Because that's the strange thing about the gold. It wasn't about the gold. Not really. It was about the idea that maybe, tomorrow, your luck would finally turn, and that's a hard thing to walk away from. You tell yourself you'll leave next week, just one more good day of panning, just one more decent strike. Then you'll sell your gear, catch a stage back east, and finally go home. But you don't, because the truth is you can't remember what home is supposed to look like anymore. Your hands are too stiff, your clothes are too thin, and your dreams are made of dirt, not doors. This was never supposed to be your life. You were just passing through, one of thousands. You came west with a borrowed map, a cheap pickaxe, and a hungry sense that maybe, just maybe, you'd be the one to make it work, but you didn't. Not really. Sure, you got a few specks, a pinch here, a flake there. Enough to make you think it was starting. Enough to keep you hooked, enough to convince yourself that you weren't wasting time, just building momentum. But the big strike never came. And now, you're not chasing gold anymore. You're chasing the ghost of the person who once thought it mattered. You're not alone out here, there are others. Men who walk like their backs were bent by the hills. Faces hollowed out by too many winters. Eyes that don't blink quite right anymore. You pass each other without speaking. Just nods. Just shared silence. Because what else is there to say? You know what it means when a man stops panning. When his boots are still sitting by the river the next morning. When the sheriff walks through camp with a shovel and a blank expression. Sometimes they go quietly, slipping beneath the surface of a stream one night, their pockets filled with rocks. Sometimes they just walk into the hills and never come back. No farewell letters, no last words, just gone, erased like the gold that brought them, and no one really talks about them, because if you do, you start wondering when it'll be your turn. You were supposed to build something here, a future, a fortune, a house back east with curtains and a dog and a front porch that didn't tilt. But what you built instead was a rut, a hole in the ground that you keep digging, not because there's anything left in it, but because it's the only thing you know how to do anymore. You've seen people strike it rich, once or twice. A man pulls a nugget the size of his knuckle, and the whole camp erupts, drinks on him, laughter, celebration. By nightfall, the nugget's gone. So is his gold dust. And in the morning, he's just another man with empty hands. And a story no one believes. You've seen people lose everything too. A tent goes up in flames. A claim gets jumped. A man gets beaten over a rumor. You stopped asking why. You stopped asking anything. And the land stopped answering. A long time ago. The hills don't shimmer anymore. They bleed. Trees are stripped. Streams are sludge. Whole slopes are gone, blasted apart by water cannons that chewed through earth like teeth. The birds left. The fish died. What's left is mud and ruin. And still, more people come. Still, they walk off boats and wagons, eyes full of light that'll be gone by the first hard frost. You want to warn them, but you don't, because you remember being them. And you know they wouldn't listen anyway. It's not all grit and graves. Sometimes you get a warm fire, a stew that doesn't taste like rust, a night where no one yells or bleeds, a woman who smiles at you even if she's paid to, and for a minute you believe it again, that you're just passing through, that you'll find something soon, that you're almost done. But then morning comes, and the gold pan is still empty, and the boots are still damp, and the hole is still waiting. The worst part isn't the pain. It's the way you forget what life felt like without it. You used to measure time in seasons. Now you measure it in blisters, in the distance between you and the next meal, in how many more swings your shoulder can take before it seizes up again. You forget your old name, the one people called you before you became minor or stranger or just, hey you. You forget the voice of your father, the taste of your mother's bread, the way your brother laughed when you used to race by the creek. You forget yourself, because no one came here to be remembered, and when the gold is gone, when the land has nothing left to give, when the camps rot and the tents collapse, and the last saloon turns into a barn, you'll still be here, buried in a shallow grave near a creek that doesn't flow anymore, a name carved into pine or not at all, a footnote, a forgotten man in a rush that swallowed thousands and only fed a few. They'll write books one day, you think. They'll call it legendary, romantic, a grand adventure. They won't talk about the smell, the loneliness, the way the air turned to grit in your lungs. They won't mention the men who died poor, mad, or simply vanished. They'll say it was about opportunity, but you'll know the truth. It was about hunger, not for gold, but for meaning. And out here, meaning weighs less than dust. You probably don't think about coal much. Most people don't. It's not exactly a glamorous part of history. No gold rush, no shimmering castles, just dust, black, choking dust. But for millions of people, coal wasn't just something they burned, it was something they lived inside of. Let's say you're born in a coal town. Doesn't matter where. Could be Pennsylvania, could be Wales, could be a pit village in northern England where the hills roll grey and the air tastes like ash before you've even had breakfast. From the moment you can walk, you know one thing for sure, your life's going underground. Your father goes down into the shaft every morning, lunch pail in one hand, a grim kind of calm in his eyes. Your mother stands in the doorway and watches him go. She never says goodbye, not really, just nods, because goodbyes in coal towns sound too final, too tempting. You grow up fast. By 12, you're already working, maybe sooner. You lie about your age because the family needs the money. Or maybe you don't have to lie. No one's checking. Your first job might be trapping. That means sitting alone in the dark, deep, inside the mine, opening and closing ventilation doors when someone passes. You sit for hours, in silence, no light. Just the sound of earth settling above your head and the occasional scurry of something that isn't supposed to be there. Later, you graduate to hauling, or sorting, or swinging a pick. There's a rhythm to it. Swing, crack, shovel, breathe. Swing, crack, shovel, cough. It doesn't matter if it's cold, doesn't matter if your hands bleed. The coal keeps coming and so do you. The mine is alive in a way that no one outside really understands. It groans, it drips, it breathes. You can hear it shifting above you, behind you, beneath you. Sometimes it settles like an old house. Sometimes it doesn't. You know the difference. You learn the difference quickly. You don't think about the weight, not consciously, but it's there. Thousands of tons of earth pressing down, one bad, timber away from collapsing. You joke about it, laugh even, but everyone knows someone who didn't come back. Within weeks, whispers spread faster than the mail service. Gold in California. That was all anyone needed to hear. The rumor tore through towns and farms like wildfire. Sailors abandoned ships in San Francisco's harbor. Shopkeepers left. Stores half-stocked. Farmers, clerks, blacksmiths. They all packed what little they had and set off westward. Some walked. Others rode wagons. Many braved the sea, rounding Cape Horn or cutting across Panama. They left homes, families, entire lives behind, not for guarantees, just for the chance. The possibility that fortune lay buried beneath a riverbed, waiting, to be scooped up by anyone with a pan and a little luck. By 1849, they were pouring in by the tens of thousands. They came from every corner of the United States and from halfway across the globe. Chinese laborers, Latin American miners, Australians, Europeans, all converging on the same dusty promise. They called themselves the 49ers. But here's the thing. The men who found the gold, Marshall and Sutter, they never got rich, not even close. Sutter's land was overrun, his crops trampled, his livestock stolen. Marshall died in obscurity. The gold they found made other men rich, merchants, transporters, speculators, but not the men who first held it in their hands. Because the gold rush wasn't just about gold. It was about everything that happened when too many desperate people chased the same dream. Imagine arriving in California after months of travel. Your boots are falling apart. You're sick of hardtack. You've sold your last coat for passage across the plains, but there it is, San Francisco, or what's left of it, because the city you pictured isn't really a city anymore. It's a sprawling mess of tents, ships turned housing, and hastily nailed-up saloons. There are no sidewalks, just mud, rivers of it. Streets are choked with carts, shouting men, and the overwhelming smell of unwashed ambition. A hammer costs $10. A single egg might run you $5. There are no price tags. Everything depends on how desperate you look and how greedy the seller feels that day. You head inland to the gold fields, the Sierra Nevada, the rivers. You find a stream, maybe even a claim someone swears is still productive. And then you begin, bent over freezing water, swirling a tin pan full of gravel, hoping for a flicker. Some days, you find nothing. Most days, really, because the truth is the easy gold and the kind that could be picked up by hand was gone by the time most people arrived. Placer mining, the gentle scooping of surface gold, didn't last long. Soon it was rockers and sluices, then picks and dynamite, then hydraulic cannons blasting entire hillsides into slurry. The miners weren't just men with dreams, they became engineers of destruction, and all the while the dream held. You believed the next pan might be the one, the next dig site, the real motherlode. You'd stay a little longer, work a little harder, because you didn't come all this way to give up. Around you, a makeshift town takes shape. Canvas tents, rough log cabins, saloons with names like the Dusty Mule or Fortune's End. You get to know the barkeep, the man who sells. Boots, the woman who cooks rabbit stew and doesn't ask questions. Everyone here came for gold. But most of you stay because leaving empty-handed feels worse than dying trying. Fights break out. Over claims, over stolen tools, over rumors. Guns settle disputes faster than courts, which barely exist out here anyway. The sheriff might be drunk, or crooked, or both. Vigilante justice isn't a last resort. It's the usual method. You try not to think too hard about it. Instead, you focus on the next day, the next hole, the next handful of gravel that might just change your life. But as the sun sets behind the pine-covered ridges and the cold creeps in, you realize something else. You're not chasing gold anymore. You're chasing the version of yourself that still believed it was out there. And maybe, just maybe, you're not sure who that person was anymore. The sun doesn't rise in the gold fields. It drags itself up. It spills light over the tents, over the broken shovels, over the barefoot boy already scooping water from a frozen creek. It catches on metal pans and rusted nails, and the teeth of a pickaxe jammed into a tree stump. And somewhere in the haze, men groan awake, if they slept at all. This isn't a place built for comfort. The boomtowns of the gold rush didn't start as towns. They started as accidents, camps that grew legs. Someone struck a nugget, shouted too loud, and within weeks there were 100 people digging holes in the same hillside, arguing over which dirt belonged to whom. They called them boomtowns for a reason. They boomed. Fast, loud, chaotic, and they collapsed just as quickly. One week you're living next to a man who's convinced he's found a vein the size of his leg. The next week his tent is gone. So is he. Maybe he struck it rich. Maybe someone else struck him and took what he had. No one asked too many questions. You hear the names whispered. Placerville, Hangtown, Angels Camp. Some of them stick around, most don't. A bar opens on Monday, burns down on Friday, and is back by Sunday. Because if you can sell whiskey and warm potatoes, you've already found more gold than the men up in the ridges. That's the thing no one told you. The miners weren't the ones who got rich. The real fortune was in the buckets, the boots, the boards for building saloons. It was the people selling picks, not the ones swinging them, who banked the biggest nuggets. And the people kept coming. Every day, new faces wandered into camp. Dirty, hopeful, coughing, wide-eyed. Some from Boston, some from Shanghai, some from Mexico, some from Missouri. Some with nothing but a sack of salt pork and a second-hand pan. Others with gold teeth, silk shirts, and a pistol that gleamed too clean to have seen any real use. They all thought they were different, that they'd strike it lucky. Most didn't. Instead, they got cholera, or frostbite, or robbed. Or if they were lucky, they just got bored and left. Some drifted downriver to Sacramento, some joined a cattle drive, some joined a gang, and then there were those who stayed, the ones who couldn't let go. You see them in the corners of the saloons, hunched, over makeshift maps, scribbling in coal on damp paper. I heard there's gold in Yuba, one might whisper, a fresh strike near Sonora. But they said that last month too, and the month before that. The strikes kept moving, farther, harder, wetter, wilder. The desperation deepened. When the surface gold ran out, people got creative, or violent. Some turned to hard rock mining and digging deep into the hills, carving tunnels, bracing shafts with rotting wood. Others brought in hydraulic cannons. Yes, actual cannons, not for war, but for blasting the hills into dust. It worked. Sort of, but it also turned streams into sludge. It buried farms. It wrecked entire landscapes. Hills disappeared. Valleys flooded. Fish died. Towns turned brown. What once was a river became a slow-moving channel of poison and dreams. No one stopped. Not yet. This wasn't an age of environmental concern. It was an age of get what you can before someone else does. And the land paid the price. So did the people. Let's talk about them for a moment, as the people the gold rush left behind, even while they were still alive. Start with the indigenous tribes. California wasn't empty before the gold. It was full. Full of forests, full of villages, full of lives that didn't revolve around shiny metal flakes. But to the newcomers, those lives didn't count. Native people were seen as obstacles, or worse, labor. Some tribes were hunted. Others were starved out. Others were enslaved under legal loopholes dressed up as apprenticeship or correction. Between disease, displacement, and outright slaughter, California's native population dropped catastrophically, nearly 90% in less than 2 decades. That wasn't an accident. It was part of the rush. Then there were the immigrants. The Chinese in particular came in waves, thousands of them. Most arrived with the hope of earning enough to support their families back home. They worked abandoned claims. They built canals. They opened laundries. They didn't fight, didn't argue, they just worked. And for that, They were met with suspicion, violence, and eventually taxes meant to drive them out. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 was targeted directly at them. It didn't stop them from digging, just made them dig harder for less. Others were pushed out too. Mexicans, Chileans, free black men. Even white miners from the east who arrived too late were sometimes bullied out of claims by those who'd gotten there a month earlier. The gold didn't discriminate, but the men certainly did. Justice in the camps wasn't a courtroom, it was a rope or a bullet or a shove into the river late at night. So where does that leave you? Let's say you've lasted a year, maybe 2. Your shoulders ache, your skin's cracked. Your clothes are patched with canvas and caked in mud. You still carry your pan, but it's more out of habit than hope. And maybe, just maybe, you've finally found something. One glint, then another. A pocket of dust in a bend of the river that others missed. You cash it in, you get coin, real coin. You head to the nearest town, buy a warm meal, maybe a better pair of boots. You sleep in a real bed for the first time in months. Then, you wake up and it's all gone. Robbed, swindled, cheated, or maybe just lost in a haze of cards and whiskey and too much noise. You walk back to your hole with nothing but a hangover and a story, and still you stay. Because that's the strange thing about the gold. It wasn't about the gold. Not really. It was about the idea that maybe, tomorrow, your luck would finally turn, and that's a hard thing to walk away from. You tell yourself you'll leave next week, just one more good day of panning, just one more decent strike. Then you'll sell your gear, catch a stage back east, and finally go home. But you don't. Because the truth is, you can't remember what home is supposed to look like anymore. Your hands are too stiff. Your clothes are too thin. And your dreams are made of dirt, not doors. This was never supposed to be your life. You were just passing through, one of thousands. You came west with a borrowed map, a cheap pickaxe, and a hungry sense that maybe, just maybe, you'd be the one to make it work, but you didn't. Not really. Sure, you got a few specks, a pinch here, a flake there. Enough to make you think it was starting. Enough to keep you hooked, enough to convince yourself that you weren't wasting time, just building momentum. But the big strike never came. And now, you're not chasing gold anymore. You're chasing the ghost of the person who once thought it mattered. You're not alone out here, there are others. Men who walk like their backs were bent by the hills. Faces hollowed out by too many winters. Eyes that don't blink quite right anymore. You pass each other without speaking. Just nods. Just shared silence. Because what else is there to say? You know what it means when a man stops panning. When his boots are still sitting by the river the next morning. When the sheriff walks through camp with a shovel and a blank expression. Sometimes they go quietly, slipping beneath the surface of a stream one night, their pockets filled with rocks. Sometimes they just walk into the hills and never come back. No farewell letters, no last words, just gone, erased like the gold that brought them. And no one really talks about them. Because if you do, you start wondering when it'll be your turn. You were supposed to build something here. A future, a fortune, a house back east with curtains and a dog and a front porch that didn't tilt. But what you built instead was a rut. A hole in the ground that you keep digging. Not because there's anything left in it, but because it's the only thing you know how to do anymore. You've seen people strike it rich. Once or twice. A man pulls a nugget the size of his knuckle, and the whole camp erupts. Drinks on him. Laughter, celebration. By nightfall, the nugget's gone. So is his gold dust. And in the morning, he's just another man with empty hands. And a story no one believes. You've seen people lose everything too. A tent goes up in flames. A claim gets jumped. A man gets beaten over a rumor. You stopped asking why. You stopped asking anything. And the land stopped answering. A long time ago. The hills don't shimmer anymore. They bleed. Trees are stripped. Streams are sludge. Whole slopes are gone, blasted apart by water cannons that chewed through earth like teeth. The birds left. The fish died. What's left is mud and ruin. And still, more people come. Still, they walk off boats and wagons, eyes full of light that'll be gone by the first hard frost. You want to warn them. But you don't. Because you remember being them. And you know they wouldn't listen anyway. It's not all grit and graves. Sometimes you get a warm fire. A stew that doesn't taste like rust. A night where no one yells or bleeds. A woman who smiles at you even if she's paid to. And for a minute you believe it again. that you're just passing through, that you'll find something soon, that you're almost done. But then morning comes, and the gold pan is still empty, and the boots are still damp, and the hole is still waiting. The worst part isn't the pain. That's the way you forget what life felt like without it. You used to measure time in seasons. Now you measure it in blisters, in the distance between you and the next meal, in how many more swings your shoulder can take before it seizes up again. You forget your old name, the one people called you before you became minor or stranger or just, hey you. You forget the voice of your father, the taste of your mother's bread, the way your brother laughed when you used to race by the creek. You forget yourself, because no one came here to be remembered, and when the gold is gone, when the land has nothing left to give, when the camps rot and the tents collapse, and the last saloon turns into a barn, you'll still be here, buried in a shallow grave near a creek that doesn't flow anymore, a name carved into pine or not at all, a footnote, a forgotten man in a rush that swallowed thousands and only fed a few. They'll write books one day, you think. They'll call it legendary, romantic, a grand adventure. They won't talk about the smell, the loneliness, the way the air turned to grit in your lungs. They won't mention the men who died poor, mad, or simply vanished. They'll say it was about opportunity, but you'll know the truth. It was about hunger, not for gold, but for meaning. And out here, meaning weighs less than dust. You probably don't think about coal much. Most people don't. It's not exactly a glamorous part of history. No gold rush, no shimmering castles, just dust, black, choking dust. But for millions of people, coal wasn't just something they burned, it was something they lived inside of. Let's say you're born in a coal town. Doesn't matter where. Could be Pennsylvania, could be Wales, could be a pit village in northern England where the hills roll grey and the air tastes like ash before you've even had breakfast. From the moment you can walk, you know one thing for sure, your life's going underground. Your father goes down into the shaft every morning, lunch pail in one hand, a grim kind of calm in his eyes. Your mother stands in the doorway and watches him go. She never says goodbye, not really, just nods, because goodbyes in coal towns sound too final, too tempting. You grow up fast. By 12, you're already working, maybe sooner. You lie about your age because the family needs the money. Or maybe you don't have to lie. No one's checking. Your first job might be trapping. That means sitting alone in the dark, deep, inside the mine, opening and closing ventilation doors when someone passes. You sit for hours, in silence, no light. Just the sound of earth settling above your head, and the occasional scurry of something that isn't supposed to be there. Later, you graduate to hauling, or sorting, or swinging a pick. There's a rhythm to it. Swing, crack, shovel, breathe. Swing, crack, shovel, cough. It doesn't matter if it's cold, doesn't matter if your hands bleed. The coal keeps coming and so do you. The mine is alive in a way that no one outside really understands. It groans, it drips, it breathes. You can hear it shifting above you, behind you, beneath you. Sometimes it settles like an old house. Sometimes it doesn't. You know the difference. You learn the difference quickly. You don't think about the weight, not consciously, but it's there. Thousands of tons of earth pressing down, one bad, timber away from collapsing. You joke about it, laugh even, but everyone knows someone who didn't come back. Sometimes it's gas, a smellless whisper that fills the tunnel and takes a whole crew before they realize what hit them. Sometimes it's water, a wall of it breaking through from an old shaft, swallowing lamps and boots and names. Sometimes it's fire, or something worse, something silent. And when it happens, when the mine swallows its own, there's no ceremony, just a siren, a whistle, and a chalkboard outside the manager's office with names written in white. Fathers, sons, brothers. You see families waiting at the mouth of the mine, standing still. No one cries right away, not yet. They wait for someone to come up and say it out loud that he's gone, and then they go home because they still have mouths to feed, because the next shift starts at dawn. That's what the mine does. It teaches you how to keep moving, even when part of you wants to lie down and never get back up. You get used to the dust. It cakes everything. Your skin, your food, your lungs. You blow black phlegm into rags and keep going. You come home with it in your eyes, your ears, your hair. You try to wash it off, but there's always some left. Some of it never leaves. Your skin changes, your lungs change. Your posture, your gait, your voice, it all hardens. The mind shapes you, bends you, breaks you if it wants, and still, you go back. Because what else is there? It's not like you have options. No one teaches Latin in a cold town. No one cares about poetry or painting. You don't save money because there isn't any to save. You rent your house from the company. Buy food from the company store. Your wages are just numbers on a ledger you're never allowed to see. You live in a row house that looks just like every other row house. Your neighbors cough like you do. Their boots are worn in the same places. Their children look like yours, sharp-eyed, hungry, older than they should be. And if you try to leave, try to work somewhere else, good luck. You've got black dust in your lungs and calluses that don't translate to factory work. You're a miner. That's all you are, all you'll ever be. Sometimes the town talks about organizing, maybe a union, maybe a strike, maybe a way to make the company treat people like people. Sometimes the talk turns to action. A walkout, a protest, a picket line, and then the guards show up with guns, with clubs, with fire hoses. The company doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It replaces you. And when it finally does give in after weeks or months of starving and bleeding and burying your dead, it does so just enough to keep you quiet. The mind doesn't care who you are, only what you bring up. It keeps its secrets, keeps its dead, keeps your life quiet and short and mostly invisible. Years pass like that, dozens of them. You go down, you come up, and somewhere in between your joints begin to betray you. Your cough worsens, your back gives, your fingers tremble, and one day someone tells you not to bother coming in tomorrow. You're not fast enough anymore. You go home. Sit in a chair that leans a little too far back. Listen to the mine in the distance like a dog that stopped barking, and you wonder what it was all for. No fortune, no fame, just black lungs and a crumbling row house with a roof that leaks when it rains, but the town keeps going. Another boy takes your place, another lunch pail, another name to write in chalk when the mountain takes its due, and so it goes. Down below, always waiting. They say time passes differently underground, but it doesn't really. It just forgets to tell you when it's moved on. Above ground, the world spins. Governments rise, wars begin, radios get built, cities stretch higher. But underground, nothing changes. There's no horizon to watch, no sky to track, just a damp kind of stillness and the sound of your own breath echoing back at you, in coal. Towns' birthdays don't mean much. You don't celebrate them so much as survive them. One more year your lungs kept going, one more winter without a cave-in. You measure your life in pay stubs, not candles, and if you're lucky, your body just slowly gives out before the mind does. But most men aren't lucky. They get the cough. That's what people call it, like it's a neighbor or a nickname. It starts as a tickle, just a little rasp at the end of the day, but then it keeps going. It shows up in your sleep. It wakes you up in the middle of the night. You spit black. You cough until your ribs ache. You lean over the kitchen sink with your hands braced against the basin, wheezing into a cloth while your wife pretends not to hear. Everyone knows what it means. They call it black lung now, but you knew what it was long before it had a name. You knew what it did to men, how they shrank, how their skin grayed, how their voices went thin and tinny, like air leaking from a tire. There's no cure. There's barely treatment. Maybe a tonic, maybe some whiskey, a blanket, a chair closer to the fire. And you sit there, hollowing out, while the mind keeps moving on without you. Outside, the younger men start to take over. They still laugh, still race each other down the hill toward the shaft entrance like fools. They still believe they'll get out someday. You don't tell them otherwise. What would be the point? You just nod when they pass. Maybe lift your hand, maybe not. Because you know how it ends. Not just the cough, not just the collapse, but everything, all of it. The town, the work, the silence that swallows it whole. Sometimes, you walk the edge of town, past the slag piles and the creek that isn't clean anymore. You see the row houses, the laundry lines, the grey coal dust that clings to the windowsills like frost. You pass the company store. Still overpriced, still the only one. You see the schoolhouse maybe, if it's not been closed. Kids running. Out at the end of the day, their shoes kicking up the same black dust their fathers breathe in before supper. You think maybe they'll leave. Maybe they'll be the ones to get out. And then you see one of them pushing a wheelbarrow behind his older brother, already learning the path down into the seam. And you realize the mine's not done yet. It still has more names to take. There were towns that tried to change, tried to build something else. But you can't build much on coal dust and busted promises. When the mine slows, the whole town slows. When the shafts shut, the shops shut. When the trains stop hauling, the people stop coming. No new jobs, no new hope, just silence. And the wind rattling tin roofing like old bones. The union tried to fight it. And for a while they did. Men stood together, refused to go down, held the line. But the company waited them out. Always did. They had lawyers, politicians, guards. And if those didn't work, they had hunger. Hard to hold a sign when your kids haven't eaten in 3 days. Harder still when the papers call you ungrateful. So the line broke. Not all at once. Just a few crossed first, then a few more, until it was just the loudest ones still left, staring at their own footprints in the snow, realizing the strike was over before it began. And the mine kept going, because the mine always keeps going. It doesn't remember the dead. It doesn't care about the sick. It doesn't reward the loyal. It only waits. And when you're too broken to swing a pick, too bent to haul coal, too tired to keep coughing, it shrugs you off like dust from its shoulders. You don't age in the dark. You just settle, like the layers of soot that line the tunnel walls, one more trace of a life that no one will ever bother to scrape clean. You sit on your porch, watching a boy head down into the pit for the first time. He's got your boots. His mother packed him a lunch. His shoulders are still straight, and you say nothing. Because what is there left to say? It doesn't happen all at once. The mine doesn't shut down with a loud announcement or a dramatic final shift. No one gathers to say goodbye. There's no ceremony, just one morning when the bell doesn't ring, 1 week when fewer lamps flicker down the shaft, and then nothing. The town wakes up like usual. The coffee brews, the coal stoves click and pop, but the trucks don't rumble. The cages don't lower. The dust doesn't rise, and everyone knows the mine's gone quiet. They always said it would happen someday, that the seams would thin out, that the owners would pack up and leave, that the coal would dry or the costs would rise or that something newer, cleaner, easier would come along. No one really believed it, not until it happened. Now there's a hole in the ground that no one dares go near. Still deep, still dangerous, still filled with the weight of everything that happened down there. But now it's still, and stillness is worse than anything. There are men who refuse to admit it. They show up anyway, sit by the gate, smoke, talk like they're just waiting for orders to come down. They lean on shovels that won't touch dirt again. They remember the way their fathers stood in that same spot. They remember the whistle, the call of the foreman, the heat off the carts full of fresh black rock. But it's all memory now. Everything feels like memory. You walk through the town and see it peeling, boards over windows, grass between the bricks, kids with nowhere to be, men without the calluses they once wore like armor. The company store is empty. The school has 3 teachers left. The post office, if it's still open, delivers mostly bills and goodbyes. The dust still lingers. You'd think it would blow away once the mining stopped, but it doesn't. It clings, settles deeper into the wood, the fabric, the lungs. You still cough, but now there's no paycheck to soften it. Some people leave. Those with somewhere else to go. Those with enough savings or luck or relatives in places where the sky's blue and the air doesn't taste like history. But not everyone can go. Not everyone wants to. Because how do you walk away from the only place that ever knew your name? Your house may be sagging, your boots falling apart, your lungs half filled with ghosts. But this is where you lived, where your children were born, where your wife buried her laughter in a kitchen that never stayed warm, where your father went down into the dark and didn't come up one day, and no one could explain why. The mine isn't just under the town, it is the town, and even when it stops taking, it never really gives anything back. Now the only thing that moves through the streets is the wind. Some days it carries the smell of rain, but mostly it carries silence, a silence that hums through every doorway, every church pew, every rusted nail that once held someone's future to a wall. You pass the old entrance sometimes, out of habit. It's boarded now. There's a sign, faded, splintered, nailed sideways. Danger. Keep out, you almost laugh. That warning's a century late. Inside the shafts it's still cold, still damp, still filled with the memory of 1,000 boots, 1,000 breathless mornings. The walls know your name better than your neighbors do. You spent more time down there than you ever did above ground. And now no one speaks of it. No one asks what it was like. No one remembers the names on the chalkboards, but you do. You remember everyone. There's talk of turning the place into a museum, maybe something to bring in tourists. Heritage, they call it. History. Something to put on a brochure, but the town knows better. This wasn't history. This was survival, day by day, shift by shift. Name by name, you can paint over the walls, install plaques, hang up hard hats on hooks for decoration, but nothing will ever clean the air. Not really. The silence is heavier than the coal ever was. You live out your days watching the world forget. The IT papers never wrote about your town, not unless there was a disaster, not unless something exploded or flooded or trapped men behind a collapsed timber. Then they came with headlines and quotes and sympathy that dried up by the next edition. But the day the mine closed, barely a sentence. Operations suspended due to market conditions, that was it. No names, no funerals, no thanks, just a sentence. You sit in your chair and cough and wait. There's no pension, no parade, no photo on the wall. The kids in the next town don't even learn about miners anymore. They don't know where the heat in their homes came from, where the steel in their cars was forged, where the electricity that lights their phones was first pulled from the earth by hands like yours. You're not angry, just tired, because that's the truth no one tells you. The mine never stops taking, even after it's closed, even after it's quiet, even after you've forgotten what daylight used to feel like on your skin. It still takes. It takes your breath. It takes your time. It takes your name. And when it's done, when there's nothing left, it leaves you with silence. And dust, always dust. They don't tell you about the weight. Not really. When the drums beat and the banners wave, they talk about honor, about sacrifice, about standing behind your man, about doing your part at home while he fights the good fight somewhere far away. They talk about duty and knitting circles and keeping the hearth warm. They don't talk about the silence because silence doesn't sell posters. At first you believe the letters will come regularly, that he'll write every week, that he'll fold little pieces of himself into the envelopes, jokes, memories, maybe a pressed flower, or a scrap of something that smells like the last time you saw him. You wait by the door, you check the box twice a day. You write back carefully, making your penmanship neat even when your hands shake, and for a while they do come. Then, they don't. Sometimes it's just a delay, a change of camp, a missed courier. At least that's what they tell you. But eventually the gap between letters gets wider, and your words start to dry up too. You try not to write about how you can't sleep in the middle of the bed, how you flinch when someone knocks at the door, how the baby's growing and doesn't remember the sound of his voice. You try not to write that you miss him so badly. It makes your bones ache, because you don't want to distract him. He has a job to do, so you stay quiet, you swallow it. You hang his coat by the door like he might need it again. And you wait. That's the thing they never told you. War doesn't only happen on battlefields. It happens at kitchen tables, in the rooms where a voice used to echo, in the eyes of children asking when their father's coming home, and you don't have an answer that doesn't tear you open. You learn to wear your grief like a uniform too. Not loud, not wet with tears, just tidy, just polite, just quiet, enough to not make anyone uncomfortable. You nod when people say he died for a good cause. You say thank you when they drop off a casserole or offer to mow your lawn. You sit in the church pew while the names are read. You fold your hands and try not to shake. They don't tell you how many women there are like you. Whole streets of them, whole towns, rows of houses with curtains drawn and porch lights left on like little shrines to men who are never coming back. Some women remarry, eventually, some don't. Not because they don't want to, but because no one wants to marry. The woman who makes a room fall quiet when she enters. You carry something with you, something people can feel but never name. A silence that sticks to your shoulders, your wrists, your smile. The kind of silence that makes people look away, And it's not just the loss, it's the erasure. You go from being a wife with a future to being a footnote in someone else's story. Oh, that's the widow of... And then they say his name like it's a title you wear, instead of the man you used to laugh with, argue with, sleep beside. Your whole identity shrinks down to someone else's absence. You write letters that never get answered. Birthdays come and go. Your children grow taller. You forget the sound of his footsteps, and yet every now and then you swear you still hear them. That's the thing about waiting. It stains you, not all at once, but slowly. Like tea left too, long in the cup. Like photographs left in the sun. You fade even as you stand still and nobody notices, because war has moved on. The flags are folded. The songs have stopped. The stories are now trophies polished for history books and parades. No one wants to talk about the quiet aftermath, the long, slow ache of a life rearranged around an empty chair. But you know, you live it, and you wonder how many more letters were never sent, how many hands reached for a pen but couldn't, how many uniforms were folded and returned without ever holding the man who wore them. You wonder if he thought of you at the end, if he remembered your face, your laugh, the way you stood in the doorway that last morning, pretending to be brave, and you wonder what would have happened if he'd come home, if any of them had. People imagine grief like a thunderclap. A sudden break in the clouds, a loud noise, a single devastating blow. But that's not what it is. At least not here. Here, grief settles in like fog. It's quiet, creeping. You don't even notice it at first. Just a few things out of place. A cup you can't bring yourself to wash. A drawer that stays closed. Then one day you realize you haven't opened the wardrobe in 3 months because his shirt is still hanging there, and you don't know what to do with the weight of that. The world doesn't stop for widows. The rent is still due. The children still grow. The weather still ruins your garden. You get tired, but not the kind of tired sleep fixes. You keep going, though. You always do. Because that's what you're expected to do. Keep calm and carry on. Smile politely. Be proud of his sacrifice. Be grateful for the folded flag and the condolences typed neatly on official letterhead. They call you strong, like it's a compliment. Like they aren't the ones who made you become this. It's easy to romanticize the clock towers now, the elegant faces, the delicate hands. But inside, it was anything but graceful. The machines were massive, loud, unstable, wooden drums wrapped with ropes, iron weights that could crush a man. Axles the size of tree trunks. If something slipped, the clock didn't just stop and it shattered. Clockmakers lost fingers, lost eyes, some lost their minds. There are records of men who claimed the ticking followed them home, who spoke to their machines like they were children, who swore the gears whispered back. But they kept working because the king needed his hour. Time became politics, a tool of order, a weapon of empire. In Paris, the city bell rang at fixed intervals to keep markets moving. In Nuremberg, merchants calibrated business hours to the tower clock. In Prague, the astronomical clock didn't just show hours. It showed the position of the sun, the moon, the saints, and the apocalypse. Kings used clocks to prove control. That they could make even the heavens run on their command. That they could bend time to their will. A divine trick in iron clothing. But the truth was far less divine, because once you build time, you have to maintain it. Clocks rust, gears slip, teeth grind down. The more complex the machine, the more fragile it becomes. One clockmaker dies, and suddenly the whole town doesn't know when to pray, when to trade, when to sleep. Bells ring late, fights break out, people miss mass. In a world where time was new and feared, that wasn't just an inconvenience. It was chaos. So they trained more clockmakers, built guilds, guarded the secrets like spells. Apprentices spent years learning not just the machines, but the rhythms, the math, the art of silence. Because time, once loosed from heaven, had to be tamed by hand. You think a king holds power with a sword? Maybe. But in the 14th century, the real crown was ticking, and the men who oiled the gears knew it. By the 15th century, clock towers were rising like stone trees across Europe. Paris had one. Strasbourg had one. Venice had a beauty with bronze. Men who rang bells with hammers. Even sleepy towns with nothing more than a market and a mayor were scrimping and saving to get one built. Because if you had a clock, it meant you were important. You mattered, you kept up. But building a clock was one thing, keeping it alive was another. Clockwork didn't forgive. A bit too much moisture, and the wheels would swell. A few grains of grit, and the teeth would crack. Everything had to be precise, measured, lubricated with animal fat or rare oils. And if something went wrong, people noticed. Not just because the hour was off, but because entire towns relied on that hour. It wasn't just nobles who measured life by the bells anymore. The butcher timed his salting. The baker timed his loaves. Laborers worked from the 3rd bell to the 7th, and heaven help the man who kept swinging a hammer past Compline. Entire cities were synchronizing themselves to these ticking machines, and the men who maintained them quietly held the whole rhythm of society in their hands. Clockmakers were no longer oddities. They were necessities. And so, like all necessary men in the Middle Ages, they were organized into guilds. The guilds were strict. Entry took years. Apprenticeship meant sweeping floors, carrying parts, and watching, always watching. You learned. Not just how to file a gear, but how to hear it. You had to know the difference between a healthy click and a dangerous one. You had to feel if a weight was pulling too fast, or if the bell hammer was just a hair too light. And once you were in, you guarded the secrets like scripture. There were no manuals, no diagrams you could take home. Everything stayed within the guild walls. If someone broke a code, say by trying to sell clock parts to an outsider, they weren't just fined, they were blacklisted, sometimes worse. Because the last thing a king wanted was a rival clock that ticked a few seconds faster and made his city look behind the times. The kings, meanwhile, were getting impatient. Precision became obsession. In court, noblemen debated seconds like they were scripture. One duke in Flanders nearly imprisoned his own clockmaker for allowing a 5-minute lag during a state procession. The man was only saved because a bishop argued that time itself was still a gift from God and not yet perfectible by man. But the kings didn't want perfection. They wanted control, and they learned that nothing says control like ringing a bell, on the dot, day after day, century after century. Some rulers had special timekeepers built into their private chambers, not just for show, for monitoring. One German count reportedly kept a small gear-driven device by his bed and checked it nightly, making notes in a leather-bound journal about which servant failed to wake him on time. Clockmakers became part of the court, but never of it. They were summoned like alchemists or torturers, necessary, precise, but a little bit unsettling, too quiet, too clever, too close to something holy and unnatural, because the deeper they went into their craft, the stranger it got. Some clockmakers began dabbling in automata, early machines that mimicked life, wooden angels that flapped wings, tiny soldiers that marched in circles, a bishop that raised a hand in blessing every noon. These were marvels, yes, but they were also warnings. If you could make a man that moved, what else could you fake? One story tells of a clock in Milan where every hour a miniature judge passed sentence on a criminal figurine. Gears pulled the man's head back. A mock axe dropped. The townspeople gasped every time, not at the execution, but at the precision. Because if a fake man could die on time every day, why couldn't real ones? And beneath the wonder, fear simmered. Clocks stopped being just about time. They became about judgment, about discipline, about punishment for lateness, for laziness, for deviation. The bells didn't just signal work. They signaled obedience. People began to resent them. The countryside still kept to the sun. Farmers didn't care if the city rang 12 chimes. If the wheat wasn't dry, it wasn't harvest time. But in cities, the bell was king. Late to mass? The bell says you've sinned, missed the market. The bell says you're too slow. Children were whipped for tardiness. Workers docked for arriving after the hour. Time became morality, and the clockmakers became its priests. But here's the part they didn't plan for. Once time is visible, people start to challenge it. Merchants argued over bell discrepancies between towns. Scholars debated the true hour. Astronomers clashed with theologians about whether a clock should follow the sun or the stars. Even peasants began to notice when the tower clock seemed off. A few brave souls even climbed up to confront the keepers themselves, demanding answers in angry, dusty voices. Time, once invisible, was now political, and the kings, they didn't like losing control. Some ordered multiple clocks comparing their output. Others hired 2 clockmakers, each to watch the other. The irony was bitter. Men trusted to measure the cosmos now had to compete for their own credibility. The machines got better, smaller, more accurate. But the price got heavier. The more precise the hour, the less room there was to breathe. And the clockmakers, those quiet architects of structure, began to feel the walls closing in. Not because their gears slipped, but because the world started, expecting perfection. And perfection, they had learned, is the one timekeeping task no human hand can truly sustain. Eventually, the bells became background noise. That's the irony. What began as a marvel, a ringing tower that turned the sky into a schedule, slowly faded into habit. People stopped looking up when the hour struck. They stopped pausing their steps. The noise became part of the city's bones, like the wind or the toll of church bells. Expected, ignored, assumed. But the gears still turned, and someone still turned them. In every city, in every village that could afford a clock tower, there was a man behind it. Usually just one, sometimes 2 if the town had money, always unpaid enough, always half forgotten. The clockmaker, tucked into a narrow stairwell chamber, surrounded by grease and dust and mechanisms that only he could read. He didn't get thanks. He didn't get holidays. He got complaints when something slipped by 2 minutes. And when something snapped in a broken pinion, a cracked gear, a rusted weight, it was always his fault. Even if it had been failing for years. Even if it was the Lord Mayor's cousin who cheaped out on the iron, so he worked quietly. He learned not to make mistakes, or at least not to make them noticeable. He'd wake at midnight to wind the weight again, counting the turns by heart. He'd chisel new teeth for a gear with hands that never fully uncurled anymore. His ears rang from the constant clang of hammers and bells, so he read lips better than most monks. His family, if he had one, lived around his hours. Meals at odd times, sleep in snatches. Birthdays missed because a mechanism slipped, and he had to spend 10 hours realigning it before sunrise. The clock didn't stop, so he couldn't either. Sometimes the men behind the gears were buried with honors, especially if they served for decades. A priest might say a few kind words. A bell would toll fittingly, not for the hour, but for the man who once made it ring. But most of the time they were replaced quietly. One apprentice steps up, one name scratched out in a dusty ledger. The bells continue. The people don't notice, because time once made does not pause for its makers. But there were stories, not in official chronicles. Those cared more about kings and crusades. No, these came from letters, market gossip, the recollections of monastic scribes who liked to chat with the tower men on stormy nights, stories of obsession. One keeper who swore his clock could predict death, striking 13 before anyone passed. Another who added a hidden second hand. No one asked for, just to see if anyone would notice. They didn't. He went mad shortly after, claimed the machine was mocking him, said time didn't belong to people anymore, that it had learned to feed on them. The guilds frowned on such talk, so did the bishops, because if time was divine, then the clockmaker was merely a steward, not a prophet. But something had changed. Quietly, under all the ticking, when kings started measuring the days not by sun or prayer, but by the hand of a machine, they shifted more than just policy. They shifted belief. The world, once filled with sacred rhythms and seasonal mysteries, now moved in predictable cycles. Predictability gave comfort, but it also gave the illusion of control. People began to expect the future. They timed crops, they timed punishments, they timed sermons. Scribes wrote that hell was for the disordered, for those who ignored the hour, who missed mass, who walked past curfew. Time became law, and in a strange way the man oiling the gears became an extension of that law, but he never held power, he only maintained it. By the 16th century, the clocks were everywhere, towers in towns, pocket sundials for nobles. Eventually, table clocks, then wall clocks, then watches. Time moved from the sky to the cathedral to the home to the body. Measured, managed, expected. And the kings? They still ruled, but now even they had schedules. Meetings by the half hour, banquets timed to the minute. The clock, once their servant, had climbed to the throne beside them. They could not rule without it. But no one remembered the names of the men who built it. No statue for the first clockmaker, no cathedral for the ones who made centuries tick by hand. Just worn ledgers, old brass tools, a few scratched initials on the inside of a tower bell frame. And the legacy? You carry it. Now every alarm, every calendar reminder, every email marked sent 9:02 a.m. It's all part of the old machinery. The gears you no longer see but that still grind beneath your day. You wake by a clock. You eat by it. You love by it. You work, mourn, and die by it. And you never question where it came from. Because the kings may have ruled the lands, but it was the clockmakers who conquered time. Let's be honest, when you picture the Byzantine Empire, hygiene probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind. You might think of gleaming mosaics, endless theological debates, emperors with too many names, or maybe Constantinople's famously thick walls. But beneath the marble and theology, Byzantium had a secret weapon. Not its armies, not even its bureaucracy. It was hygiene. Yes, hygiene the Byzantines washed. A lot. In a world where many cultures still saw regular bathing as suspicious, even sinful, the people of Constantinople scrubbed, soaked, and scented themselves with surprising dedication. They had public baths, private baths, foot baths, and ceremonial baths. Soap wasn't just a luxury. It was practically a requirement. And it didn't stop there. They wore socks. Linen, wool, silk if you had the coin. Not just for warmth, for modesty, for status, for purity. The Byzantines took grooming seriously. You clipped your nails. You cleaned behind your ears. You scented your robes, and if you didn't, people noticed and judged. But here's where it turns. This wasn't about health. Not really, this was about order. See, the Byzantine world revolved around the idea of taxes, divine order, everything in its place, the emperor under God, the army under the emperor, the church intertwined, but never quite above the throne. And in daily life, cleanliness was part of that hierarchy. If you were clean, you were obedient. If you were dirty, you were suspect. There were rules about who could enter churches. You had to be washed. Your garments had to be proper. Women had to be ritually clean. After childbirth or menstruation, men had to wash before prayer. Even icons were regularly wiped down, not just out of reverence, but out of fear. Dirt invited demons. Filth meant chaos. Public bathhouses were everywhere. Holdovers from Roman infrastructure, sure, but adapted and defended by the Byzantines long after the West let theirs crumble. Some emperors even subsidized them. Others used them for diplomacy. It wasn't unusual for a high-ranking official to invite a rival to a shared bath to talk politics. Naked, in hot water, staring each other in the eye. Awkward, maybe. Effective, definitely. But the dark side of all this soap and steam was the way hygiene became weaponized. It wasn't just about who was clean, it was about who wasn't. Foreigners were dirty, barbarians were filthy, heretics too, and rebels? Well, rebels smelled. And if they didn't, someone made sure the rumors said they did. And if you fell from favor, suddenly your hygiene got questioned. There's a record of a courtier who, after being accused of treason, was mocked in pamphlets for smelling of goat. Whether he actually smelled or not didn't matter. Dirt was political. Smell was slander. Even emperors weren't immune. When Emperor Phocas was overthrown, chroniclers described him as greasy, sweaty, unkempt, the language of filth used to paint him not just as cruel, but unfit. Dirty rulers, dirty rule. It didn't matter if he actually bathed. In Byzantine politics, clean skin meant clean soul. And clean soul meant legitimacy. And that brings us to the real twist. Hygiene was surveillance. There were attendants in the baths, servants in the dressing rooms, monks who inspected purity. Gossip swirled in steam rooms. Whispers started in the act of washing another man's back. You thought the bath was a place of rest? Maybe. But it was also a place where alliances formed, and fell apart. People died for less. The emperors understood this. That's why they bathed with care. Publicly, sometimes. With ceremony, with witnesses. They showed their purity. They displayed it. Their robes were scented, their hands scrubbed. Their sandals changed between rooms, because in a world where cleanliness meant righteousness, no stain could be allowed, not even a symbolic one. And so the socks mattered. The soap mattered, not just as hygiene, but as propaganda. Walk through. Constantinople on any given morning, and you'd smell it before you saw it. The mingling aroma of incense, roasting fish, drying linen, and something else. Soap. Olive oil based, boiled with ash and lye, sometimes blended with crushed herbs or lavender. The rich bought it in cakes. The poor bought the water it was boiled in. In Byzantine society, there was a clear line between those who washed and those who were watched. The upper classes didn't just bathe. They bathed to be seen. It was ritual, routine, and reputation. Their robes were bleached to a shine, their tunics scented, their hair trimmed and shaped. Men oiled their beards. Women painted, their faces with imported powders, then bathed again to wash it all off before the next act. But what mattered more than the act itself was who saw you do it. In monasteries, hygiene was discipline. Monks were expected to wash regularly, even when fasting. Cleanliness wasn't luxury. Here it was self-control. A dirty monk was seen as spiritually untethered. A clean one, in contrast, was prepared to meet God. Monks even clipped their nails on schedule and kept their bedsheets scrubbed. But outside these orderly walls, things were messier, especially for the workers who kept everything clean. Soap makers were often poor. Ironically, many of them reeked. They handled animal fat, lye, and ash, the backbone ingredients of all cleanliness. The fumes stung the eyes and burned the lungs. Their shops smelled sharp and sour. Few customers stepped inside. Orders were made from the street, and the irony. These soap makers were essential to the health of the capital, and yet banned from entering certain parts of it. Some neighborhoods posted signs forbidding the carts that carried their barrels. It was a strange contradiction. Produce purity, but stay outside. And then there were the bathhouse workers. Most were slaves or freedmen. They stoked the fires, carried the water, scrubbed the floors, and they saw everything. You learned quickly what happened in the bathhouse did not stay in the bathhouse. Men with secrets often forgot themselves in the steam. Political rivals whispered behind soap-lathered curtains. Courtiers offered bribes between rinses. Foreign envoys were watched more closely in the bath than in the council chamber. The Imperial. Police had names for this. Soft surveillance. Observing without overt control. Watching the body to learn the mind. Even doctors were part of it. Byzantine medicine, heavily influenced by Galenic thought, was obsessed with the balance of the four. Humors. Cleanliness wasn't just healthy, it was diagnostic. A dirty body hinted at internal imbalance. An unwashed noble might be suspected of depression. A peasant with strange sores could be labeled dangerous before a single word was spoken. This fear of filth ran so deep, it even shaped city design. Constantinople's aqueducts were masterpieces. Water was carried for miles through stone channels, feeding fountains, cisterns, and baths. The city had public latrines, many with running water. Underground sewers ran beneath market streets, and street sweepers were employed to clean gutters regularly. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than most of Europe for centuries to come. But here's the dark side. All of this was tightly controlled. Water was taxed, soap was regulated, bathhouse access was limited by class. If you were poor, you bathed. At night, or not at all. There were reports of guards turning away laborers from public baths during imperial hours, when nobles had priority. Others were charged extra for soap or forbidden from using clean towels. If you carried the scent of dirt too heavily, some taverns wouldn't serve you. And if you stank in church, people moved. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about caste. And, in some ways, it was also about fear. Plagues terrified the Byzantines. Rightfully so. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century wiped out a third of the empire's population. It reshaped the economy. It ended dynasties. And ever since, filth became synonymous with death. Not just physical death, but social. Horatia. So if you smelled wrong, people stepped back even if you were innocent. This bred paranoia. About neighbors, about servants, about beggars. Especially beggars. Public health in Constantinople was often indistinguishable from public suspicion. Officials watched the markets for signs of illness. Leper colonies were moved outside city gates. Sick children were hidden. Poor mothers doused their babies in herbal rinses, not because it cured anything, but because it masked the smell. The message was simple. If you wanted to survive in Byzantium, you had to smell like you deserved to. And the consequences of failure weren't always metaphorical. There are court records, dry, brittle, buried in imperial archives, that describe cases where individuals were barred from testifying because they were deemed too unclean. No mention of what crime they witnessed, just their odor, their appearance, their unhygienic state. Truth, it seemed, didn't travel well on dirty feet. Meanwhile, the emperors cloaked themselves in layers of scent, frankincense and myrrh, oils imported from Arabia, rosewater baths twice daily for some. One emperor had lavender scattered on the marble steps before he entered, so his arrival could be sensed even before it was seen. Smell became symbolism. And symbolism in Byzantium was everything. Because if the emperor's body was pure, the empire must be sound, and if the soap ran out, people started to wonder. At its height, Byzantium gleamed. The golden domes, the polished marble, the aqueducts gurgling with clean water, a city wrapped in silk, incense, and ambition. From a distance, Constantinople looked like it would last forever. But inside the walls, something was cracking. Not the infrastructure. Not at first. The baths still flowed, the fountains still ran, but something else was rotting. Not in the drains, but in the trust. See, when your entire system equates cleanliness with virtue, with control, with order, then the moment something dirties, it's not just inconvenient. It's apocalyptic. The signs were small at first. A bathhouse closed for repairs and it never reopened. Soap prices surged because a trade route faltered. Water stopped flowing to a poor district, and no one rushed to fix it. And suddenly, people started smelling again. For an empire that tied its identity to hygiene, this was more than discomfort. It was humiliation, fear, blame. And blame in Byzantium could burn cities. When the plague returned in waves, as it often did, the theories were as sharp as the blades. The poor were blamed, foreigners were blamed, Jews, pagans, heretics, prostitutes. Anyone whose scent didn't match the perfume of imperial purity was cast out. You didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to sweat. Even the emperor's body came under scrutiny. Rumors spread that one ruler bathed only once a week. Another refused scented oils. Whispers called them cursed, unblessed. And in an empire, where your body was the symbol of God's order, that kind of gossip could end dynasties. It wasn't about dirt. It was about decay. It was about fear of collapse disguised as concern for cleanliness. Meanwhile, the soap ran thinner. Trade routes. Frayed. Arab and Persian merchants once brought ingredients, lavender, oil, spices, into the capital. But those routes were under siege. The Crusaders diverted cargo, pirates disrupted ports, salt became expensive, ash grew rare, people still bathed, but less often. They still wore socks, but cheaper ones. They still scented themselves, but with old perfumes watered down and reused. And the bathhouses. Many turned into barracks, or warehouses, or empty stone ruins filled with dust and forgotten towels. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it wasn't conquered by filth. It was conquered by force, cannons, sieges, strategy. But it had already fallen long before, from within. Because the obsession with purity only works if the system stays pristine, and nothing stays pristine forever. Not when your water supply is poisoned by war. Not when your soap makers are dying in poverty. Not when your bathhouses are used for interrogations. Yes, That happened too. In the empire's final centuries, the same bathhouses that once hosted ambassadors and courtiers became convenient locations for interrogation. The heat, the sweat, the lack of clothes, it made people vulnerable. Easier to break, easier to threaten. It wasn't official policy, of course, just quiet practice. The empire that once cleaned itself into spiritual order now boiled its enemies in silence, and even the monks, once paragons of hygienic ritual, began to fray. Records show a decline in regular washing. Plague fear pushed monasteries into isolation. Rituals were shortened. Hair was left untrimmed, and some began to view personal dirt as a form of holy humility, a return to spiritual suffering. The irony? The cleaner the empire tried to be, the filthier it became when it failed, and yet its legacy survived. Today, people still marvel at Byzantine aqueducts. Tourists visit the ruins of Roman-style baths with awe. The art, the architecture, the mosaics, all speak of a civilization that valued beauty, symmetry, cleanliness. But no one remembers the soap makers. No one remembers the bath slaves, their hands burned from years of pouring boiling water. No one remembers the street sweepers who scrubbed the filth so the upper classes could pretend it didn't exist. All that survives is the illusion. Byzantium, clean and eternal, but beneath the marble, always, the grime. And perhaps that's the real truth. Empires don't fall in fire alone. Sometimes they slip on their own polished floors. Sometimes they forget that behind every perfumed robe is a body sweating to survive. And under every empire's soap dish, there's a crack. So now you can rest. The gears will keep turning. The bells will chime. The town will sleep beneath. The weight of time, never knowing the face behind the dial, never seeing the soot on your hands or the way your fingers tremble before dawn. You gave them order and they gave you silence. That's the way of things. Let it be enough. As the tower fades into shadow and the last echo of the bell slips into the night, close your eyes. Let the ticking grow distant until it becomes a whisper, then nothing at all. And if you enjoyed our quiet walk through this forgotten corner of history, if this small piece of the past helped you drift a little closer to sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more sleepy stories, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It's always a comfort to know how far these quiet voices carry. Until next time, breathe deep, sleep well, and let history keep the time. Good night.